I would say the establishment of an independent trade union is a much bigger aim in a communist system than freedom. Actually, because freedom is something you may have or may not have. Memory on Solidarność and on the democratic turnaround of 1989 is pretty polarized and diversified, if you want to have it in a more positive wording, in Poland until today.
For the Baltic people in Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, also to speak and act more freely was quite difficult. So you had large crowds also singing together.
Ükskord me võidame nii kui nii.
In the summer of 1988, more than 300,000 Estonians gathered at the Song Festival grounds in Tallinn, nearly a quarter of the entire population of the country. Traditional folk songs and new patriotic anthems filled the air, but it was not only a cultural festival, it was a space for political symbolism. On that stage, artist and activist Heinz Volk declared the words that would become a rallying cry for a nation. One day we will win, no matter what. These words captured the spirit of a movement that would soon be known as the Singing Revolution. It began with environmental protests against Soviet mining projects, but quickly grew into a nationwide call for sovereignty. Drawing on a century-old tradition of song festivals where choral singing had always carried national identity, Estonians reclaimed their voices as a tool of resistance. By singing together, they not only defied the Soviet authorities, they reminded each other of who they were and of the independent future they longed for. I'm Janine Funke, historian and science journalist from Germany, and you're listening to Fighting for Freedom, a 5-part podcast series exploring how societies across Eastern Europe have dealt with the legacy of dictatorship and how uprisings against Soviet rule shaped their path to independence. In the first episode, we set the stage on what contested memory actually means, how Soviet power in the 20th century reshaped the region, and why history is being weaponized today. With Violetta Davolute and Juliane Fürst from the EUROPAST project, we talked about public history, bridging personal and collective memory, and why involving the public actually matters. And historian Jens Schöne guided us through the first mass uprising against Soviet rule on June 17 in the year 1953 in the GDR. You will find a link to that episode in the show notes. In this episode, we talk about Poland and the Baltic states in the 1980s. We look at the Polish uprising of 1980 and the Singing Revolution in Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. And we ask, how did these movements actually challenge Soviet power and why do they still matter today? Let's first turn our attention to Poland. At the end of the Second World War, Poland became a Soviet satellite state. The Communist Party ruled over Moscow's backing, but Polish society never fully subdued. The Catholic Church remained strong and traditions of resistance were alive. And again, protests erupted. In Poznan in 1956, on the Baltic coast in 1970. Each time, the regime promised reforms. But little changed. Economically, the country slid deeper into crisis. In the 1980s, the tension broke. Strikes began at the Gdansk shipyards, where workers found an independent trade union, Solidarity, or in Polish, Solidarność, led by Lech Walesa. Within weeks, millions joined. For the first time in the Soviet bloc, there was a legal mass opposition movement. And this movement was a turning point, not only for Poland, but also for all Eastern Europe. To understand its roots and significance, I will speak with Florian Peters. He is historian of Central and Eastern Europe at the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena. Florian, thanks for joining us.
Hi, hello.
Before we go deeper into the events themselves, their meaning and how they were remembered today, could you first give us some historical context? What were the specific circumstances in Poland that actually led to this uprising against Soviet power?
So I think the first thing we need to make clear, we're talking about 1980, 1981, 1989 in Poland, is that usually people would not call that uprising for one very specific reason, because as you may know, in Poland, there's a long, long history of uprisings. There has been the Warsaw uprising in 1944, of course, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in 43. But all of these have been military uprisings. So people fought actually against their oppressors. And what happened in 1980-81 was pretty different from that. It was consciously different from that in that people did not take weapons for fighting off the communists, but they decided to set up an independent union, an independent trade union called Solidarność, which quickly developed into the gigantic mass movement, actually transcending the character of a trade union quite quickly, and having around nearly 10 million members by 1981 in the course of very, very few months. This is not an uprising, so to speak, but it's the biggest mass social movement in younger European history. This was quickly evolving into a huge alliance also between the workers and the intellectuals, oppositional intellectuals, quickly merged and actually transcended these socio-economic claims, which had been at the beginning of this strike movement, into a political aims. And this political aim was mainly actually the granting the independence of this trade union, which was something which was unthinkable in a state socialist system, and which was thus really revolutionary, so to speak. The Polish communist leadership decided not to shoot this movement down, but to find a compromise, find an agreement, and also even grant independence to this independent trade union. In the end, the Polish communist leadership changed, and General Wojciech Jaruzelski came to the top, and he decided then to declare martial law and actually to suppress this movement by military means. So this is actually the what happened, and what then did not end actually this movement, but changed its character and was then in a way blocked for a few years. The opposition movement then reorganized in the underground. There was a alternative cultural sphere, so to speak. And this was actually preparing the political turn of 1980-89 in a very specific way, because the opposition movement that had been formed in 1980 under the leadership of Solidarność was then accepted by the communists as partners for the round table talks, and they agreed on some compromise again, which was meant to share power mainly. But then in the elections, which had been agreed on, partly free elections, Solidarity was so successful that in the end this turned out the dynamics ended up with a Solidarity-led government, which came to power in late August 1989. The first one in Eastern Europe so far.
So if I understand you correctly, the creation of Solidarność was less about immediate freedom in an abstract sense, but much more about building an institutional safeguard, something that guaranteed rights and self-organization in a system that had denied them. Would you say that this makes 1980 fundamentally different from earlier uprisings like in East Germany in 1953 or Hungary in 1956? In these uprisings, the demand was mainly freedom, right?
I would say the establishment of an independent trade union is a much bigger aim in a communist system than freedom. Actually, because freedom is something you may have or may not have. But the Poles, they had their experience already with protesting against the communists. And workers always had protested and there had been these demands. But now they had understood it is not enough to claim for social rights or for freedom, political freedom of expression or something. But they needed an institutional guarantee for freedom, for self-organization, for democracy. Yeah, and the trade union was actually meant as this institutional guarantee for that. So the establishment of Solidarity was actually the result of a process of learning from earlier protest movements under communism, and also, as I've said before, also from the less successful military uprisings in the 19th century and under German occupation in the Second World War. So this was already something like the quintessence of the Polish protest history of the 19th and 20th century. That said, of course, this trade union wasn't not an aim in itself, so to speak. It was rather seen as a guarantee, as an institutional guarantee for development, which would then ensure that the communists would have to grant more and more political, economic and social rights to the workers, actually mainly because they were seen as the main subject of this movement at the time.
You just mentioned that Solidarność was intentionally peaceful. So would you say that we shouldn't really speak of an uprising, but rather of a planned peaceful pressure movement, one that tried to change the system without overthrowing it?
It was intentionally peaceful. Yeah, it was not about fighting the communists. It was about using peaceful means to pressurize the communists to grant rights, so to speak. Yeah, rights for trade union self-organization. Yeah.
And was this kind of approach something unique to Poland, or were there similar tendencies in other Eastern Bloc countries, for example, in Czechoslovakia or Hungary? Was Poland exceptional here, or part of a wider trend of late socialist opposition?
Well, no, I mean, it was, of course, part of broader developments in the late socialist era, so to speak. And there were close links, mainly to opposition movements in Czechoslovakia and also in Hungary, which were primarily intellectual movements by intellectuals such as Václav Havel or others. But it was like the pioneering movement, and certainly it was seen by the others this way as a pioneering movement which would then inspire other movements in other places.
You also hinted at international reactions. How did actors outside Poland, governments, churches, ordinary citizens respond to and support this movement?
As the aims of these movements were pretty broad, and as this included like trade union freedom, socio-economic rights of workers, but also national dignity, national independence, religious dignity, so to speak, there was a pretty broad range of Western actors who were interested in this cause of this movement, actually. And there was a broad solidarity movement among ordinary people in the West, including Western Germany, France, the United States. So there were a lot of parcels sent to Poland, by ordinary people who wished to support the Poles under suppression. And this was organized mainly by Caritas and other church organizations then, because all the others were not allowed to operate in Poland anymore under martial law.
Looking at today, Solidarność was once seen as a role model for peaceful transition, but memory of it seems contested in Poland today, shaped by different political camps. How would you describe the role of Solidarność in Polish memory today?
As you may imagine, this huge unique, I would say, mass movement in modern European history had big influence and big shadow, so to speak, on Polish memory. And it had a central place in many different narrations on how the new democratic Poland had come to existence. At the same time, there was and still is, a big challenge to integrate both these experiences of 1980, 1981, which really were often described as a carnival of solidarity, which was a really mass experience of freedom, of taking part in a collective endeavor to change your place for the better, so to speak. And to balance this with the experiences of 1989, it was followed by the harsh austerity measures of the so-called Balcerowicz plan, which was the first neoliberal shock therapy in Central and Eastern Europe, which was then again taken as a role model for others in the years to come. And all these experiences were pretty ambiguous, yeah. So it was difficult to integrate this into one smooth, so to speak, narration, and that's why memory on Solidarność and the democratic turnaround of 1989 is pretty polarized and diversified, if you want to have it in a more positive wording, in Poland until today. So there is a left-wing narration on Solidarność, which exposes the trade union character of that in the first place, and also mainly counterposes it to the neoliberal transformation that happened afterwards. There is a more liberal narration, which rather sees this as a continuous history of liberation, of political liberation, which started in 1980 and was then successfully completed in 1989. And then there's also a right-wing narration, which is more focused on the national and religious dimensions of this movement, and which tends to see 1989 not as a successful completion of what has been started in 1980-81, but rather as a negation, as a chance that has been missed for finishing this national and religious rebirth, so to speak, of the Polish nation. Yeah, and then it's, of course, the liberal leaders of the Solidarność movement, who are accused of having agreed on a compromise with the communists. They are accused of simply being traitors to the cause of the Polish nation, which would have deserved a real anti-communist revolution in 1989.
And what about generational differences? Do younger Poles remember or relate to this history in a different way, especially given today's political shifts?
There is a tendency for some years now, which has been also fostered, of course, by political development, by the government in the last years, to streamline this national history in a pretty, towards more national content. And this is pretty visible in what young people think and in the information they have about the past and also the recent past, which definitely influences a certain shift from the perspectives of those who have experienced this era and often experience these developments as pretty ambivalent developments, to a more streamlined version, which is more about questions of national dignity, the question of traitorship by liberal elites. I would also say that the right-wing shift among younger people in Poland is not so clearly linked to memory politics. I would say there's a gender imbalance there, because younger women are tending to vote rather left and liberal in Poland, and it's younger men who actually turn right-wing. Also, attitudes towards Ukrainians, which is an important issue in the last time now, which is of course exploited by right-wing parties who see Poland being flooded by Ukrainians.
Finally, stepping back from Poland, what can we in Europe more broadly learn from this democratic protest movements? How can the history of uprisings actually help us strengthen democracy today?
I do think history and historical memory can be important for learning something. Yeah? I think what is most important about public history, public memory of recent events like the Solidarność movement in Poland, the anti-communist uprisings in other Central Eastern European countries, independence movement in the Soviet bloc from 1990-91, is to be aware about the complexity on the one hand of these movements. There is not one big issue, but there's always has been a lot of important mixtures of different interests, of different longings, of different imaginaries about the future, many of which have always been disappointed then. Yeah, so I think this is key to understand that even a successful revolution will not be able to realize from day one 100% of its claims. And these democracy movements, or movements for democracy and freedom we have been talking about, they are important today for us to understand that democracy is nothing which is a given, or which can be realized one day to the other, but it's something which is a quite complicated thing and also needs to be renegotiated, needs to be accepted as a compromise. Compromise also means that you have to accept points you don't like so much, yeah. But this is what we actually learn from this history. You need a vision. You need an imagination of a future which is attractive to a broad spectrum of society. This is key, of course. But then it's also key to be ready to accept that this vision will not be realized 100%. Yeah, and that democracy implies that it's not enough to fight your enemy, fight the communists or fight the Russians, but you always need, in the end, to find a way to accommodate different interests. And the Polish story is a story of they started to fight the Russians, then they realized it's not enough, they need a trade union for securing their rights, and then they reached a compromise with the communists, which in the end was successful for paving their way into a democratic and European country.
What becomes clear from your reflections is that democracy is never finished. It always has to be renegotiated, protected, and reimagined. The story of Solidarność shows both the power of peaceful resistance and the compromises that come with it. Thank you very much, Florian, for sharing your insights with us. Solidarność became a milestone not only for Poland's path to independence, but also as an inspiration for other countries in Eastern Europe, like the Baltic states. As Florian Peters explained, the memory of this movement is anything but simple. For some, it remains first and foremost a workers' struggle. For others, it is a story of political liberation. And others frame it as a national and religious rebirth, with 1989 not seen as a victory, but as a missed chance. These different interpretations show how strongly memory and politics are intertwined. And that brings us back to what we discussed in our first episode. Memory is always contested. It is shaped by power, by the stories that are told and those that are silenced. And in Poland, just like in Eastern Germany in 1953, remembering the fight for freedom is not only about the past, it is also about the present and the kind of democracy people want to build today.
Ma tänan teid, ma armastan teid.
Let's turn to another example, the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Their path to the Soviet Union was marked by immense trauma. After the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, all three countries were occupied by the Red Army in 1940. What followed was brutal. Mass deportations, executions, the dismantling of independent institutions. Then came the German occupation during the Second World War, which brought new atrocities, above all, the persecution and murder of the Baltic Jews. In countries as small as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Holocaust destroyed entire communities. And when the Red Army returned in 1944, the circle of repression began again. For decades, the memory of these crimes and the loss of independence weighed heavily on society. And yet, by the 1980s, people across the region found a new way to resist. Inspired in part by the Polish example, but rooted in their own history, Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians came together in what became known as the Singing Revolution. Through mass demonstrations, cultural expression, and above all, the power of collective, non-violent action, they challenged Soviet rule. how this unfolded in each of the 3 Baltic states, how it differed from the Polish experience, and how its memory is shaped today in the shadow of renewed Russian aggression. That is what I will now explore with postcolonial scholar and Estonian associate professor at Tallinn University, Epp Annus. I spoke to Epp in August 2025. Epp, thanks for joining us for this podcast.
Hello, and thank you for having me today.
Epp, to start with the basics, what exactly was the Singing Revolution and how did it unfold across Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania?
Yes, so here we're talking about the late 1980s, talking about the time of great changes in the Soviet Union, basically its economic collapse. Gorbachev is in power, and there is a sense that some great reforms need to be done. And this period of turmoil and move towards perestroika and glasnost, it gave a possibility for the Baltic people in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania also to speak and act more freely, because before that we had censorship and it was quite difficult to really think independently of what was happening in Moscow. And so this is a period, and you can date it to perhaps to late 1986. Sometimes it's dated also somewhat later, 1987, up to 1991, when the Baltics all have gained independence. So basically it's a period of decolonization from the Russian rule, from the Soviet Union, and there are different ways how to explain it, but Singing Revolution is one label that is often used, especially for people outside Estonia and for politicians. So it's not so much a scholarly term. And why Singing Revolution? Because we had actually these mass protests where song was also used as a method of protest. So you had large crowds also singing together.
Why was singing so central to this movement? Was it specially linked to Baltic cultural traditions or more of a practical form of protest at that time?
It definitely is especially related to the culture of the Baltics. I mean, we had the first song festival in the Baltics, a major one, was in Estonia in 1869. So this is a tradition that stretches back to 100 years and more. And it was overtaken by the Soviet rule because it was considered a good tool of propaganda, people singing together songs glorifying Stalin, for example. What else do you want? And so it was indeed one way of national self-expression, which was very much controlled during the Soviet era, but you cannot control it fully. So choirs, when they rehearsed, when they traveled from place to place, they sang all kinds of songs. And also in these song festivals that we had during the Soviet era too, you had some songs which were superbly pro-Soviet, but then there were always others which dated back already to earlier eras, and so it was a legitimate way of national self-expression during the Soviet years already. Though I would also stress it's a little bit misleading to think about the Singing Revolution and the Baltic independence movements or re-independence movements only through this, vision of singing together. It was actually just one aspect, and maybe not even the major aspect of these years. You had environmental movements, you had intense discussions which were more grounded on political change. You also had calls to change economic situation. So the singing is just like one aspect of the whole trajectory of change during that era.
When we look at the 3 countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, would you say the Singing Revolution was a joint movement, or did it take shape differently in each country?
So usually the story of the Baltic independence movements, it starts with environmental movements. So here we are not using the term singing revolution. Then maybe the second phase is more Estonian-centered, or environmental protests are unfolded also in Lithuania and in Estonia. In Estonia, the oil shale is a major question, and the plan to start new major excavations of phosphorite in Estonia. So, and there's huge resistance towards this. So you start from an environmental movement, then you also there are questions and discussions about how to change economy. And then these particular protests where song plays a very important role. Estonia here is the core. But at the same time, you have, for example, you have a song festival of Baltic university students, which takes place in Latvia. And this is a part, maybe one of the initial parts of the singing revolution. And here you have all three countries, so to say, singing together. But indeed, most often the singing revolution is associated with Estonia, but clearly in Latvia and in Lithuania, similar large concerts were taking place.
In Poland, around the same time, Solidarność was challenging Soviet rule. How would you compare the Polish case to the Baltic experience? Were there similarities, or was the situation fundamentally different?
Yes, I mean, the Baltics definitely looked very much and were very interested in what was happening in Poland. And Sojudis was a great inspiration. And indeed, it gave courage, it gave hope that you can protest against this regime. At the same time, still as Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania were annexed into the Soviet rule, into the Soviet Union, the situation was quite different, and Moscow control was ways more direct. So there were also student protests in Estonia in 1980. These were heavily suppressed. There was also a letter of Estonian intellectuals, open letter, again, and there were heavy repressions afterwards. So in the Soviet Union, early 1980s, it was an era of great repressions. So Sojudis was not possible inside the Soviet Union at that point. So, but it was a great source of inspiration and hope, nevertheless.
Today, the singing revolution is often remembered as a peaceful revolution. Why was non-violence so central, and why do you think it worked in that moment despite Soviet repression?
I mean, you might also ask otherwise, what other possibilities were there? So we are dealing with colonized nations who do not have their own army. There were no weapons available, so there was no possibility for armed resistance because, you had Soviet army, you did not have local national units. And this was, of course, a clever strategy by Soviet rule. So in a way, this was the only possible way. And at the same time, indeed, this rhetoric of we will be peaceful was dominant. And part of it was also this sense of danger of national elimination, which was part of a cultural atmosphere in the early 1980s. Less in Lithuania, but definitely in Latvia and in Estonia, where in Latvia, Riga, the capital, actually there were more Russian speakers by the mid-1980s in Riga than there were Latvian speakers. And in Tallinn, in Estonian capital, it was 50-50. So there was a sense of there's more and more, bigger and bigger influx of Russian speakers, and there was just a sense of, as nations, we can just die out. There's not very much more than 1 million Estonian speakers. And thus, this kind of a sense of threat to national existence even was one of the causes behind this rhetoric of we need to definitely avoid violence because we might be just otherwise, wiped out as nations.
And how is this period remembered today in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania? Are there differences in how each country commemorates the Singing Revolution?
I think in all three countries it is celebrated, obviously, as a major achievement. In all three countries, I think there are great similarities. The question of national independence has been very vital and part of just like a major grounding myth of culture and indeed national self-understanding. So I see more similarities here, maybe because in Latvia and in Estonia, this influx of Russian-speaking populations was ways more significant. This sense of national threat that accompanies this conversation is more strongly present in Latvia and Lithuania. But in all three Baltic states, it is indeed a major cause for celebration, and you do have, not necessarily annual celebrations with such a mass scale. But if there is 10 years from the Baltic chain, for example, this is a big event, etc. And let me also stress that one of the central events during this period of Singing Revolution was the Baltic chain, where Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania formed this human chain where people were holding hands across three Baltic countries, more than 200,000 people participating.
If you look at today's politics, with Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine and the Baltic states sharing a border with Russia, how does this shape the memory of the Singing Revolution today?
Clearly, one important aspect is that with dissolution of the Soviet Union, decolonization in the Baltics and regaining independence, this was an era, initially it was a very much like future-oriented trajectory. There was a lot of hope. There was a lot of sense that we are moving away from something that was quite damaging towards great future possibilities. And now this narrative doesn't hold anymore, right? You can see that Putin and many other political voices in Russia have declared that their aim is to restore basically Soviet Union, have again Russian control over these territories, and that changes definitely how the era of regaining independence is viewed. And definitely one aspect of it is that at that point it was peaceful resistance. Now, to the contrary, we know that the only thing that Russia and Putin understand is weapons, is readiness, military readiness. And this is very, very much in contrast to the era of Singing Revolution. So in a way, looking from today, this narrative is kind of toothless. We cannot, go on saying that, we need to, hold ourselves together as a nation by singing. No, now it's a clear sense that this might have it worked in the past, but now we need something completely different. So in a way, there is a clear split, a clear understanding that this is something that's used to be, that is in the past, but now we are living in a completely different, era, in a different realm of possibilities and necessities.
And finally, looking at everyday life today, how present is this threat of Russia in society, in schools, politics, or even in daily routines?
I think it again varies from one Baltic state to another. As I hear in Latvia, for example, you have more of these leaflets shared to general populations, like what do you do in times of invasion. I do not see anything like that in Estonia. I think in Estonia there is more of a discourse of we still have time. This will not happen tomorrow, so we need to be ready. But let's understand right now, Russia will not invade us. So, but indeed, obviously, it's a big cultural and even economic factor because all political parties have an understanding that the military budgets needs to be extended. We need to be ready to defend ourselves. And that has an impact on economy and culture and social welfare. And of course, it also has a great impact on environmental themes, how much money you can spend on responding to climate change or reducing CO2, etc. So it is the number one factor of existence here right now in the Baltic states is the threat of Russia.
As a last question, Epp, based on your historical perspective, what do you expect for the future of the region? How might today's conflict with Russia shape politics and society in the Baltics in the coming years?
Me personally, I regret very much that we think so much about Russia's future threat. I think instead right now, ways more attention should be directed towards how to help Ukraine and support Ukraine at that very moment of history. I think Europe and of course also United States should spend ways more effort in helping Ukraine, and that actually would mean also creating a safer future for the Baltic region, because one very important question here is how will we avoid Putin winning the war in Ukraine? So, but otherwise, I do not see that there is going to be an annexation of the Baltics within the next year, at least. I think more than, but what's going to happen in 5 years, we just simply do not know.
Sure, historians cannot predict the future, but sometimes history helps a little bit to kind of put future possibilities in the picture, right? So thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
The examples of Poland and the Baltic states show two very different yet closely connected paths of resistance against Soviet rule. In Poland, workers at the Gdansk shipyards found Solidarność in 1980, the first independent trade union of the Soviet bloc. Their struggle was not about armed confrontation, but about institutional guarantees for freedom and democracy within a communist system. What made this movement so remarkable was that the regime, unlike in East Germany in 1953 or in Hungary in 1956, initially chose negotiation instead of violence. Solidarność thus became a pioneering model of how peaceful organized resistance could challenge dictatorship and eventually contribute to the collapse of Soviet control over Eastern Europe. In the Baltic states, resistance took on a different form, later remembered as the Singing Revolution. Rooted in cultural traditions and collective song, but also in environmental and political protests, the movement of the late 1980s created a powerful, non-violent front against Moscow's rule. For these small nations, without their own armies and under direct Soviet control, peaceful protest was the only possible way forward. When hundreds of thousands of people stood together in song and joined hands across the three countries in the famous Baltic chain, they demonstrated not only their will for independence, but also the strength of unity against an overwhelming power. Both cases highlight how uprisings can take shape in unexpected ways, sometimes as workers' demands for rights, sometimes as cultural expression. They remind us that resistance is not always loud and violent. It can also be collective, creative, and deeply rooted in everyday life. At the same time, they show how fragile memory remains. In Poland, today, Solidarność is remembered through very different lenses, as a workers' movement, as a liberal success story, as a betrayed national revolution. In the Baltics, the Singing Revolution is celebrated as a triumph of peaceful independence, yet current security threats have shifted its meaning. In the face of Russia's war against Ukraine, many argue that singing is no longer enough, that only military readiness can secure the future. Looking at today's headlines, Russian drones crossing into Baltic airspace, the constant threat along NATO's eastern border and the ongoing war in Ukraine, history suddenly feels very close. These stories from 1980 and 1989 remind us that democracy and independence were never given, but hard-won, and their protection requires constant vigilance. History does not offer easy lessons, but it teaches us that freedom is always contested, that peaceful resistance can change the course of nations, and that memory, however divided, is a vital tool to strengthen democratic resilience at times of new uncertainty. In our next episode, we turn to Central Asia and the South Caucasus, to Kazakhstan, Georgia, Armenia, and beyond. Here, resistance took yet another shape, shaped by different traditions, religions, and power struggles on the edges of the Soviet Empire. What role did protests play in these regions, and how are these struggles remembered today? I'm Janine Funke, and this was Fighting for Freedom.